If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what's an extremely unusual or unexplainable event that has occurred in your life? I used to always sleep on my trampoline when I was younger. I loved it. One morning I woke up in an uncomfortable position, not weird as you always roll to the center of the tramp, and had a noose around my neck. It was a really old, creepy rope. One you'd see in an old western, and the rope was not long at all after the noose. Maybe like 6 inches, like I was being hung and someone cut me down. I never figured it out. I saw a stick man. I was walking from the gas station to my house. At the time, it was the only place near my house where one could acquire snacks. The next place was Walmart, about 20 miles up the road. It was about an hour's walk to and from the gas station, but I didn't mind. I did this every day. I'm about 5 minutes away from my house when I see something dark out of the corner of my eye. I look, and at first I don't see anything, so I just look back and keep walking. But I keep seeing it, and every time I turn, it's gone. I assume it's an eyelash or stray hair, so I stop walking and start rubbing my eyes, trying to find hair or whatever. That's when I see the dark thing again, and this time I can clearly make out that it's something in the distance and not hair. I try to make out what it is, because it's really not looking like anything I've ever seen in my town. It was very long, I'm guessing almost 7 feet, and it was so skinny for its size, probably about as wide as a Pringles can. I'm dumbfounded. What the duck is this thing? I keep just staring as it gets closer, and as it does, I notice it's somewhat transparent. When it gets closer, by now, I'm guessing like 150 feet, I see it looks somewhat human. It has a circle head and long arms and legs. And that's when it hits me. It looks like a goddamn stick man. I'm scared as shit, but I try to think up a logical explanation. I don't get any. When the thing gets like 75 feet from me, it just stops. Tilts its head to the side, like it's trying to figure out something, if I can see it? Don't know. When it outstretches an arm, I piss myself, literally, and ducking run as fast as I can home, never once looking back. When I got home, I didn't see it, and I stayed locked in my house with my shotgun loaded and pointed at the door for the rest of the day. I slept with the lights on. Growing up, I would go camping with my grandparents all the time. Every summer. Really awesome memories. Anyway, my grandfather had already broken a hip at that point, so he couldn't backpack anymore. He would regale me around the campfire with stories of his glory days, hiking through Yosemite on the JMT or, on the western end, through some of the lake country. One of his favorite stories to tell was about the time he, my mom, my grandmother, and their pet dog were hiking and stayed on the trail a bit too long. He would always tell it after my grandmother went to bed. It was dark, and they were hiking by flashlight. Ahead, he heard animal voices that sounded like language. Thinking it was just someone foreign, he called ahead, "We're over here." You know, he didn't like sneaking up on their camp. The voices stopped and then became frantic. They got a bit farther away, until they were just out of earshot. My grandpa always mentioned that their dog, usually incredibly yappy, was just laying on his belly with his hackles standing on end. That's when a UFO took off from behind the next ridge, the loudest sound he had ever heard, and sped away at an insane speed. He told me he didn't sleep that night, and he stayed up with his pocket knife in hand, cradling my mother and grandmother. He also told me that they never told anyone back home because he didn't want anyone to think they were crazy. He was worried he'd get fired from his job or commit suicide. It wasn't a fun story, just this happened in the family, and we kind of keep it quiet. I always thought it was a completely ridiculous story. I mean, it freaked me out, sure. I was an impressionable little kid and already a bit freaked out by the movie Fire in the Sky. As I got older, though, despite my mother's own version of the story and the oddities, like knowing my grandfather always brought a pistol on every camping trip after that, I just assumed it was a big prank they played on me. My grandpa has been dead for, holy SHT, 15 years now. My grandmother is still around but has pretty severe Alzheimer's. She's not speaking now, but for a while she was living with my mom and dad. In order to give them a bit of a break, my wife and I decided to take her to dinner and a movie one day. This was a few years ago. She was at that point with Alzheimer's where they kind of comprehend what's going on but are a bit spacey. Where they'll think they're talking to their long-dead husband, dog, or whatever. We were talking to her about my work. It's exciting. I work on a robotic, not manned, space mission, and how she wants me to bring her pictures from my trip. She thinks I'm going. She then starts babbling about the little men that they saw one day while hiking, their super loud spaceship, and the dog not barking. It wasn't prompted. It was one of those flashes of memory that people with Alzheimer's get. My hair stood on end. I asked her if they actually saw the people, and she told me they did and that they had wished they had a gun. The conversation lasted for a couple of minutes and confirmed the story I had been told years ago. Pretty soon after, though, she slipped back into her babbling. I mean, there has to be another explanation, but I can't talk about that story without getting the worst chills. I'll never know for sure what happened, and that freaks me out the most. One early morning, 2 or 3 a.m., I was driving home on some back roads from my girlfriend's house when I was 17. There was a truck behind me for about 2 miles before the driver started getting closer to me, closing the gap between our cars, eventually getting into the oncoming traffic lane, and speeding up again. I figured he just wanted to pass me since it was a one-lane road, so I let off the gas to make it easier for him. When he gets beside me, I look over and make eye contact with this dude. It was dark, and I didn't actually see his eyes, but I knew he was looking back at me. This is when it gets weird. He slows down a little to stay next to me for what I guess was 100 or 200 feet, and then gets back behind me. I was shitting myself but started planning to lose him or defend myself. Where I'm from, the roads twist and turn through the woods, so the next time a curve separated us, I floored it and found a pretty hidden driveway to pull up in and cut my lights off. I was waiting for him to drive past me, but he never did. When I was maybe 15 years old, my brother, 17 at the time, and I were driving home pretty late at night. The road to our house had a lot of hills, so it was hard to see oncoming traffic or anything else until you topped one of the hills. When we got just over a big one, we saw a figure just standing in the middle of the road. My brother swerved out of the way and nearly went off the road to avoid hitting them. We looked back and saw nothing behind or around us. It thoroughly freaked us out, though, so we called 911 and reported it. I'm thinking it may be someone trying to attempt suicide or something. Nobody ever followed up with us about the report, though. A few years later, my brother sent me an article he came across about other similar sightings and occurrences happening on the same road. Except some of the earliest ones had dated back decades before we ever saw anything. I was snowmobiling with my brother and father at the time in cottage areas of northern Quebec, French Canada. Basically, think of cottages with only gravel roads, if at all, separating them and no vehicular access in the winter months unless on a snowmobile. For my French-Canadian friends on here, it's just west of the Manicouagan River, maybe 50 kilometers south of Manic 5. I was maybe 10 at the time, my brother was 12, and this happened in the early 90s. Our skidoo broke down in the middle of a lake, and even though it's an easy fix, easy becomes relative at -30°C before the wind chill factor and in the dark to boot. So as my dad was sweating at the skidoo, as French Canadians are known to do, my brother spotted a little cottage on the bank of said lake, suggesting we seek help or shelter. The sun was beyond the horizon, and temperatures were dropping. Figuring it was better than failing on the engine, we crossed to the cottage to find it unoccupied yet unlocked. Not too keen on the idea, but still preferable to the almost certain outcome of both his children freezing to death, my father decides to enter. It was a small, simple, yet quaint one-room cottage with a basin for cooking and washing, of course, no running water, lined by a counter, a kitchen table with 4 chairs, an old but clean sofa, and a single bed. But most importantly, a functional wood stove. My dad lit some candles, lit a fire in the stove, and told us to settle on the floor while he laid down on the couch, and we went to sleep. We didn't use the bed for fear of showing disrespect to the owner, and my dad even smoked outside, which is saying a lot from the early 90s. The next morning, we cleaned up our stuff, passed a quick broom, and left a quick thank you note explaining our situation. We went back to the snowmobile, which my dad managed to fix with daylight. It was also much warmer, and headed towards our own cottage. The weird part? Me and my brother wanted to show the cottage to our older sister, 15 at the time, so we grabbed the skidoos and headed to the cottage, maybe a 45-minute to an hour skidoo ride. We saw our old tracks, we saw our footsteps to and from the lake bank. But the cottage was half burned, and what was left of the roof had caved in, covering the 1.5 remaining walls left standing. All rotten with moss growing over it, which means it had been standing abandoned for at least a few years. We did find our note, though, in pristine condition. I'm the type of person who sleeps with multiple comforters. Between my bed and television stand, there's only about 1.5 to 2 feet of room. It's plenty of walking room, but it's super cramped to sit between 2 big objects. I couldn't even sit on my knees between the two, and I'm the second shortest, 5 feet 5 inches, in the house. Mom is the shortest but has very bad legs, so she can't. My sister is 3 inches taller than me, and my dad is 7 inches taller. You'll understand why I say this in a moment. About a year and a half ago, I woke up facing the TV. One of my comforters must have fallen halfway onto the floor during the night. What I woke up to was my comforter with someone underneath it. You know what I mean, like a big mountain dump. Someone was clearly underneath. Nothing else can make that big of a shape. It's eye level to me when leaning on my elbow, with about 2 to 3 feet off the floor. For some reason, it made me smile and think of my boyfriend. My boyfriend must be trying to scare me. I laugh and press my fingers into his forehead and push him backwards, only to have him pop back up like one of those punch bag clown boppers. Now that I've felt it, it's clearly a human head with definite weight behind it. The object is also taking the push, meaning it's not coming back up instantly. When I pushed it back as far as my arm could reach, it had stopped for a split second before coming back up. I do this once, twice, or 3 times. Each and every time, the body sits straight back up. I'm now coming out of my tired state and realizing that can't be my boyfriend. He doesn't live with me. I know that sounds really stupid, but when I wake up, he's on my mind to check for text messages and such. The terror sets in. Someone is in front of me. I've been pushing this person. But no one can possibly sit between the bed and stand. How? I absolutely 100% know that I was pushing someone's forehead, and it's heavy, not something light that can easily just come back to me 3 to 4 times in a row. Someone's under my blanket. I start to scramble to get away from the person, backing up onto my bed. I start to tear all of the blankets off of me, but they're still sitting there. Just then, my sister, going to enter her room, sees my terrified face and desperately tries to get away from something. She said my name, and I looked at her, still trying to get away. When I turned back, the person was gone. No bump. Just my comforter flat on the ground and my sister looking at me in concern, asking me if I'm okay. There is no possible way it was sleep paralysis. I was literally moving my body the entire time. Moving the bump, sitting up, and laughing. The weight, the forward and backward movement, the height, and the very clear feeling of someone's head. Then absolutely nothing happened after I looked at my sister. I was visiting my grandparents in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. Over the weeks, people reported a large black cat wandering around. Everyone surmised it was a black cougar, and people were quick to arm themselves and their properties. It was a strange time. Cougars are an extreme rarity in those parts. As in, haven't been seen in 30+ years. My parents, brother, and I were visiting up there. One evening, I said goodnight to everyone and wandered through the dark hallways of my grandparents' enormous farmhouse to the stairway. They never used their front door, but I absently decided to look outside the aligning window and into their front yard. I saw the enormous night sky, and then some sort of huge shape came running directly towards me. As my eyes adjusted, I realized, to my abject horror, that it was an enormous black wolf-like creature. It had 2 big, pointed ears and what looked like a huge tongue sticking out of its mouth. But its eyes were what terrified me the most, 2 enormous yellow-green eyes trained on me with what I felt was the utmost evil intent. I'm telling you, this thing was gigantic. At least 5 feet at the shoulder. I screamed and jumped back and prepared myself for the loud thud of the creature's body contacting the window pane. At the speed it was going, it would have hit that window easily, but I heard nothing. Timidly, I peered outside under the curtain, and there was nothing there. The yard looked as empty and dead as ever. I scanned my eyes all over the place, searching, but this thing was gone. I tried telling my parents, and they went outside to look but found nothing, not even footprints. I wonder to this day if that cougar people were seeing was really something else. My creature was definitely canine-like. Not feline in any way whatsoever. My boyfriend and I moved to the middle of nowhere to save on living costs. We have an insane amount of static electricity in our little home. Every day we get shocked by something in the house or by each other. Well, we have had at least 2 lost time incidents as well. We're doing something, and it's like 3 p.m., and next time we look out the window, it's pitch black, and we are confused. The other was that while driving around, it somehow took us 3 hours to make a 20-minute drive. Without any bad traffic. I was reading online somewhere that static electricity is a sign of aliens. Totally unrelated. I didn't Google aliens or what static meant, I just came across it on Facebook out of nowhere. My boyfriend and I don't want to put too much stock in it, but we kind of wonder if aliens are the cause of the lost time and static electricity. There was another weird day too, when we didn't have any lost time but somehow 1,000 miles were put on the car in one day of regular work commutes. It made no sense. My friends and I were exploring an old house. It was almost entirely empty, save for some religious decorations and a few water-damaged chairs. There was a cross in each room, a picture of the Virgin Mary that was covered with dead flies in the stairway leading up to the attic, and the attic itself had a big banner with the saying, "A family that prays together, stays together, written on it. We opted not to explore downstairs because it looked dark as duck and the whole place in general was starting to give us bad vibes. As we were walking towards the back exit, one friend made a joke about how it looks like a family that prays together doesn't stay together after all. We all laughed, but we were interrupted by what sounded like something falling from everywhere around us. Curiosity got the best of us, and we checked all the rooms. The crosses had all fallen. Nope, the duck out of there. I still don't believe in ghosts, but I can't explain why it happened. When I was either 14 or 15, me and my family were taking a trip through the mountains of Puebla, Mexico, which is where there are still small villages with people that don't speak a lot of Spanish. They mostly have their own dialects. Anyway, to get to the village that was our final destination, we had to drive about 2 hours through this curvy mountain road. Somewhere on this road, as we were driving, a figure dashed across the road. I thought I was the only person that saw it, but both of my parents and one of my siblings saw it too, and our instant reaction was a big "what the hell was that?" moment. The figure looked like a young, pale child, maybe 3 to 5 years old, wearing nothing but a cape and a small hat, but then again, it also didn't look like a child. We were super creeped out because we were literally in the middle of nowhere and there was no sign of anyone living anywhere near us. My family on my father's side is from northern Sweden, and we used to spend the summers in some cottages up there. One summer, when I believe I was about 10 years old, I was playing hide and seek with my younger cousins. I look behind the main house but don't find anyone. The garden is all overgrown by stinging nettles, and there aren't that many places to hide. When I'm about to turn back, I see something out in the forest. It's white and looks like a figure standing up. I immediately feel an urge to follow it, climb over the round pole fence, and get going into the forest. After a while, I stop. Why am I in the forest? I felt like I had awoken from a trance. I turn around and see the fence 50 meters back. Did I see my cousin? There was something, but she didn't wear white today, did she? I walk back quickly, almost running. It takes a while to get back due to the tough terrain. It turns out no one in my family wore white that day, and I try to forget about it. Years later, I'm reading about Nordic mythology, and I turn the page and look at an artist's interpretation of a skogsra. I feel a chill go through me, and I know right away what I saw that summer. This is true, but I can't explain it. Me and a friend had been out visiting a third friend that lives in a town quite a ways from here. The town is tiny, and to get there, you have to turn off the main road and go down a long, narrow, and winding road that crosses over a mountain. Anyway, we were at this place for a couple of hours, and when it got late, we decided to head back home. As we were driving, not yet having gotten back on the main road, my friend made a phone call and was focusing on that while looking out the passenger window, into the ceiling, etc., as one does when talking on the phone. The road we were on is, as stated earlier, quite windy and has a few hairpin turns. Having just gone through a sharp one of those in second gear at low revs, I started accelerating up the hill that followed. The hill wasn't steep, but there was a noticeable incline on a fairly straight section measuring around 700 feet, which led to a slight left-hand turn, which then went into another hairpin. On my right, I had a grass-covered hill that was angled at something like 70°, far too steep to walk down. On my left, a grassy field sloped away from me onto the road that I was driving on prior to the hairpin. I had my high beams on, but being a really old car, the lights weren't exactly pristine, but they managed to make a symmetric cone in the pitch-black landscape that illuminated the road and its sides evenly. Not something normal for a new car with symmetric lights, but it worked. I was still accelerating. I think I had reached third gear when a man came into the cone of light on the hill to my right. Before even being able to react to the fact that someone was coming down a hill far too steep to walk on, he continued onto the road in front of the car. I yelled "duck!" and stomped the brakes. As the person started crossing the road, every single hair on my body stood up. I felt a sense of panic and terror that was unbelievable. A couple of feet in front of me, I watched a hooded figure float across the road. Not high above the road, but just not walking. I blinked my eyes several times as I thought this couldn't be real. The figure continued onto the field on my left and traveled beyond the reach of my light beam. Naturally, my friend shifted his attention from his conversation onto the current situation, and he was freaking out. "What is it? What's wrong? WTF, man?" As he had no idea why I had slammed on the brakes, yelled, and now was staring into the night. Not wanting to scare him unnecessarily and afraid of being called a wacko, I said nothing, put the car in first, and pulled away. When we got to the main road, I told him what I'd seen, and he was scared shitless, but to this day he insists that he didn't see anything. I can't explain what I saw that night. I grew up in a small town that has a lot of history. It participated in the Civil War pretty actively and was used as a location where slaves would reach their last stop on the Underground Railroad since it is right on Lake Erie. There are a lot of old houses that date back to the early 19th century, and some even into the 18th century. Many of the houses have had multiple lives. Some have been barns, stores, and hospitals. Well, this particular house had been an asylum and, at one point, a makeshift hospital during the war. The asylum time, though, was particularly brutal, and a lot of people died. It is a super ugly house because it is part of the historical society and is pretty well preserved. I've only been in it a couple of times, and you get a super creepy feeling when you go in there. Even in the middle of summer, it is often pretty cold. It may be all because of the stories of activity, but there is definitely an off feeling. The basement is super creepy because there are still chains in the concrete. Anyway, my best friend when I was in middle school and high school once had a really horrific experience in the house. Our friend who lived in the house and her were in the kitchen, and a knife flew at them. Literally out of nowhere. It scared the shite out of her, and she went home. That was one of the last times she ever went back, and she refused to go into the kitchen. Apparently some of the other stuff that went on involved a lot of knocking and scratching. My friend would wake up sometimes with scratches across her back that were unexplained. One time when I visited, we took a lot of pictures of orbs, though I chalked it up to dust. I live in a rural area. There used to be train tracks everywhere, and you still sometimes find the bridges for them over various creeks and rivers around town, but never any rail. My parents and other older family members always told me they took them up in the early 1990s. I'm a heavy sleeper. Despite these things, every once in a while I wake up because I swear I hear a train blaring its horn and the distant low rattling of one passing over tracks. It usually lasts for about 10 minutes, but one time I swear it kept going for 20. I share a room with my mom because we only have 2 bedrooms, and one night I woke her up when it happened and asked her what it was. She got a perplexed look on her face, listened, and eventually just said, "I don't know." She heard the noise too, but she swears there aren't any functioning railroads around us for miles. You ask anybody else in our town, and they'll tell you the same. Both of my parents were born and raised here, if not all of their lives, then most of their lives, so they're familiar with the territory. Neither of us can ever tell what direction it's coming from because it kind of echoes around a little. It's not super creepy, but it's definitely weird and unexplainable. It happens once, maybe every couple of months. We're not particularly close with the neighbors since we're kind of spread out and one of them is a jerk, but I keep meaning to ask a friend that lives way down the road in the direction it sometimes sounds like it might be coming from if he's ever heard it. My roommates went out of town to visit friends in another state, and I was home alone, smoking weed and playing COD. My dog was laying next to me on the bed, and he seemed very uncomfortable. A while later, around 1 o'clock, I get up to use the restroom. I go to open the door and twist the knob, but it's really hard to twist. I twist harder when suddenly it goes from slightly turning to full-on resistance, as if someone on the other side is holding the knob and twisting in the opposite direction. I freak out and step back from the door in shock. I stood there for a minute in silence, just listening. Nothing. I creep to the door and hesitantly try again. The knob will not budge. I am locked in my bedroom since my handle won't move, there is no lock on my door. After a few more minutes of abject terror, I resolve to get out of my room no matter what I have to do. I grab my hunting knife and try to pry the door open, hoping, it was just a severe airlock from opening and closing my window. The moment I think the door is about to open, I hear a loud and staticky scream in a female voice, "No! Stay!" I screamed a little and actually jumped back. My dog started barking and cowering. I cower as well. I stood there for about an hour with all of my electronics turned off to hear better, but I heard nothing. Eventually, I sat on my bed with my dog, and we both stayed up all night, staring at the door. I'm still clutching my knife. The sun rises, and my mind can't take it anymore. I get up and open the door with no difficulty at all. It just opened. I stalk around every corner of my apartment, still fearing someone is there with me, but it is empty and all the locks and deadbolts are in place. It gets weirder. The next night I have a dream that I can recall 100% perfectly. I plan to turn it into a short story, which terrifies me. In my dream, I wake up with the sun pouring into my room, and for some reason, I don't have a dog. I get up like usual, make coffee, shower, etc. When I get out of the shower, I start to notice something is off. It's too quiet. I live in a very busy part of the city, and I don't hear any cars or people. I look out the window and see no signs of life. I get scared. Impulsively, I walk to the front door and look out the peephole. There is a woman in a raggy white dress with wet black hair hanging over her hidden face. She is staring back at me through the peephole, seemingly waiting for me to leave the apartment or preventing me from leaving. In my dream, I am too afraid to leave the house and slowly run out of supplies while waiting for help. I constantly check the peephole, and she is always there, waiting. I grow skinny and pale, and I eventually starve to death, never daring to leave the apartment. A friend of mine lives in a farmland or forest area. He has a kind of canvas tent in the woods that he sleeps in sometimes with his dog, a Siberian husky. One time, when I was visiting, he showed me the dog's harness and pointed out that it was cut through with a sharp object. He explained that the dog had run out of the tent sometime during the night and returned early without any leash or harness. He found the harness and leash intertwined in a shrubbery close by, with the harness cut open. We thought it very strange since few people live there and no one should have been in the woods in the middle of the night, plus the dog had made no noise whatsoever. Fast forward 2 weeks, and I was visiting again. And I'm there with another friend, to whom we tell the story and show the cut harness. I ask if he had gotten a new one, which he confirms that he had and picks it out, only to discover right then and there that it too had been cut, not all the way through but almost. We freaked a little. I went hiking with friends once outside of Los Angeles. It was night hiking to see the stars, and there were 3 of us. We hiked in pretty deep into nothing but brush and bushes, and all of a sudden we heard some sounds, not animal sounds, in the distance and saw some light pollution. This was strange because it was far deeper than your average person would hike into the hills we'd gone to. Naturally, we went closer to see what was going on, assuming maybe it was a campground. As we get closer, we see a few blotches of black shapes spaced out throughout the evening. At this point, we're pretty confused and a couple 100 yards out. We decided to go closer, but there was no trail, so we kind of shimmied over the brush. This was incredibly stupid because it was nighttime and there were snakes and yada yada, but we were stupid adolescents at the time. So about 100 yards out, one of us trips over a rock and falls into the bush. This is California bush, so it's not exactly deadly, but it can be pretty prickly, and there are cacti all over the place. The guy yells shit as he's going down, and immediately the noises from the campfire stop. We all freeze and look over, and then we see that these shapes are in fact robed people, and they're standing around a campfire, and there's not like 4 or 5 people, rather closer to 20, and they're all looking over in our direction. It's possible, looking back, that they were a bunch of goths or Satanists or, even worse, cosplayers, but it scared the shite out of us at the time. We bolted immediately and didn't look back. When I was young, I and my brother lived in a trailer near the woods. We were rednecks, Christians, and about your typical gutter children personality types. Our guardians were gone, so me and my brother thought it would be a good idea to take the .22 out and see what we could kill. It was only after a short while down the little, sun-dusted path near our residence that we found a crow flying overhead, and my brother pointed the gun up, squinted in the heat, and fired. It fell, and we thought we hit it because its body lay lifeless on the ground, but before we could check, it stood up, looked at each of us as if to get a good memory, and flew off. And being us, we thought Satan would be haunting us for the next few days, so we told our guardians what we did, though they were more concerned that we took the .22 without permission, as the words of children can often be exaggerated. However, I remember it fresh in my mind, though I don't believe any supernatural causes were behind it. I think it must have been a placebo effect, it thought it got shot, or the loud fire of the gun must have shook it for some reason and made it go into a lame state, resulting in its fall. I don't remember it being covered in any blood, so that's my guess. This is one my dad told me. When he and his brother were younger, they took a job to clean out an old lady's attic. The lady lived in a regular one-story house with a normal attic space, the kind where you can't stand up fully, you have to stoop down and crawl everywhere. She had been hearing animals moving around and wanted some of her stuff pulled out of there before it got chewed up. For some reason, the attic only had one crawl space, and it was in the living room off to one side. So they pulled up a folding ladder and put it underneath, and my uncle climbed up and pushed the door up. He popped his head through, and the attic, dimensions of space be damned, was an exact replica of the living room underneath it. Complete with lighting and doorways leading to God knows where. My dad was standing underneath, looking up, he could tell something wasn't right by the light and the way the roof looked too far up, like getting vertigo. My uncle closed the door, apologized to the lady, and they both took off. I was living in the Canadian Rockies in the early 2000s, working at a resort that was built at the turn of the 20th century. Me and an ex were living in these old army barracks. The mountains were a training area during World War I, methinks, and if anyone is that interested, I can do some research, that were transformed into staff housing a long time ago. I'll be honest, we had heard the whole lodge was haunted, which for most people already kills the story. Either way, I digress. So it begins with me picking up my ex from the Edmonton airport and driving 4 hours back to the resort in the Rockies. We arrived sometime in the afternoon and spent it in general laziness. The dining hall opened around 4:30, so I was sitting on the edge of the bed with her standing between my legs, just waiting. I heard something to the right of me on the nightstand and turned to see my CD case standing on its round end, wobbling unnaturally back and forth. I look at my ex, she looks at me. We don't really know what to say. I'm a little weirded out, but you know I've done a lot of drugs in my day, and I try not to jump to conclusions. So we laugh a bit, shrug it off, and head on down to supper. That night we were lying in bed, both of us talking softly but pretty much ready to fall asleep, when our VCR turned itself on, sucked in the tape, and started freaking RW'd or FW'd, I couldn't tell which one. We are in a dark room, and I am on the outside. She just screams turn it off, so I get up in the pitch black and pull the thing out of the wall. I was a little freaked out now, as this day was getting creepier by the minute. Laying down again, she just pretty much buried herself in my chest, and I just stared into the darkness, listening. About an hour or so passes, and I hear something faintly coming. I could hear muffled noises all around the room in different places, so many that it couldn't have been mice or squirrels, it was too deliberate and rhythmic. I just held tight and waited for the morning. I grew up near the Forks of Cypress, the plantation where Alex Haley's great-grandmother, Queen, was born and raised. I read the book Queen when I was 15. Once I got my driver's license, I used to drive by from time to time, just because it was neat to see the remains of the plantation house, which was struck by lightning and burned in the 20s, and to see the little slave cabin up next to the road. A year later, my history class took a field trip out there. I was excited, thinking I could finally go inside the cabin. Only she got there was no cabin. I got really upset. It had been there a week ago, after all. Well, it turns out that cabin burned down 5 years ago, before I ever went anywhere near the Forks of Cypress. One of my older friends helped put out that fire. There was nothing left. I started talking to people, and lots of us had seen the slave cabin more recently than 5 years ago. My best friend and I decided that if you didn't know it was gone, you could still see it. Being scientifically minded, we decided to test our theory. We brought her boyfriend and his best friend out there, told them to look for something unusual, and drove by 3 or 4 times. After our last pass, we asked what they saw. Her boyfriend replied that he couldn't see anything because of that slave house in the way. After a general freakout, we drove them back by. This time, he couldn't see it. More freakouts commenced. I still don't know how to explain any of it. It was about 3 a.m. Everybody in the family is home, my brothers, my sister, me, and my dogs. We are all sound asleep, except for my mother. She's startled by the barking of my dog, Trevor. Trevor is old as shit and generally an asshole, so we almost always disregard his barking, but sometimes you just know. She leaves the bedroom in her pajamas. The entire house is pitch black. As she descends the staircase, step by step, she can hear a faint buzzing, sort of like a vibrating phone. This is weird. Trevor sees her in the kitchen and gets that alert look on his face, like he was trying to say, I want to tell you something. Anyway, my mom checks every door. All locked. Every window. All closed. She can still hear the buzzing and follows the noise to the basement door. She is half asleep and sees nothing wrong with going into the isolated basement to find a weird noise, all while alone. Keep in mind that my basement is very large and totally unfinished. There is a cold, concrete floor, cracked stone walls, and a few hanging light bulbs with dangling pull chains. You have to walk up to them to turn them on if you want any light. There's no light switch down there. So my basement is pitch black, save for the 3 window wells that carry the moonlight in through the dirty, barred windows. As my mom climbs down the creaky wooden steps, the buzzing is becoming much louder. She enters the basement, and it is very prevalent that the sound is coming from my dad's workshop, which is hidden in a little nook on the other side of the stairs. She doesn't have a flashlight. She steps nervously on the cold stone ground and follows the moonlight around the corner. This leads her into the workshop, which is especially dark. There's the sound. My dad's sander is plugged in, turned on, and buzzing violently on his desk. My dad unplugs all of his tools when he is done with them to save energy, and he surely would have noticed if he left them on. My mom calmly turned it off when suddenly it hit her. Somebody turned this on so they could lure me down here. She sprinted through the basement, back up the stairs, and locked the door behind her. It never happened again, and we never found out where the noise came from. I was camping one weekend when I was younger and in the Boy Scouts. I had my own tent, and I believe I was sharing it with one or two friends. I remember us staying up late one night, bullshitting about girls and video games. I went to bed shortly after and fell asleep. I suddenly woke up in the middle of the dark woods, standing and still in my sleeping bag. I looked around and saw nothing but darkness. No other tents, no lights, no stars, nothing. I screamed help, but to no avail. My tent had been very near the main part of the camp and was surrounded by others, so I assumed someone would hear me. I wandered around for like 15 minutes in complete darkness, convinced I was dreaming. I tripped at one point and scraped my elbow really badly. A little while later, a light appears in the distance, and I see another Boy Scout from my troop, kind of friends, but not really, sticking his head out of a tent, which I could see clearly, but I noticed it was completely alone and isolated, not near anything. He says, "Dude, what are you doing?" and lets me sleep on the floor. I remember being awake because I was worried about a spider crawling on me if I fell asleep. I eventually get over it and pass out. I woke up the next morning on his floor with a gash on my elbow. I walked out of his tent, and it was surrounded by other tents, campfires, and small buildings. My original tent was no more than 40 feet away from his. To this day, I have no idea what happened or why I was suddenly standing in the middle of the woods and couldn't see any of the other tents around me. I sat down on the toilet once at 3 a.m., and the opening music from Star Wars started blaring crystal clear just outside the bathroom window, those wavy glass blocks instead of a regular window. The odd part is that I lived in a fairly rural place, and there is no realistic way that someone was outside that window given that our dogs were still sleeping, no car had approached or left after, and there was no sound from the gravel driveway they would have had to walk on to get to that spot. Oh, and also, the music was as clear as if I'd heard it in a theater instead of through a tile and glass wall. It stopped after about 5 seconds of sustained music. I never did figure out what happened, the weirdest SHT of my life. When I was 12, I woke up in the middle of the night, terrified of my windows. My whole body was in complete fear mode, and it told me to stay away from my windows. I wasn't a kid to be afraid of the dark or anything, so my fear was super unusual. I slowly got out of bed and made my way to the foot of the stairs, one of the only places in the house away from any windows. There was a solid wood front door, which I stood in front of and looked up at in the direction of my sleeping parents up on the second floor. I saw our little apricot poodle simply sitting at attention at the top of the stairs. The lazy bastard was never up at night. Just then, a bluish-white light poured out of the peephole in the front door and beamed its way onto the front stairs. I couldn't handle the implications of the light streaming in from the peephole like that, so I ducked under the light, walked with my head down to my bed, and closed my eyes under the covers. In the morning, my mom's friend said that on a talk radio station, people were calling in about seeing strange lights over the city that prior night. A few years ago, my best friend and I were sharing a house out in the country. One of her children was being fussy and wouldn't sleep, so we decided to take a drive down some back roads. About 10 minutes after I start driving, we are pretty far into the boonies of my city, where the street lines are few and far between and everything is terrifying. I only glimpsed them, but I swear to God I saw a pack of 3 or 4 of the most mismatched creatures ever. They were like little pigs, with human teeth and eyes, but their skin was an odd shade of pink and wrinkly, as if they had all rapidly lost weight. I screamed and floored the gas pedal all the way home. As we neared my house, about 4 houses down, I saw another similar creature that was the same shade of odd pink and had the same texture of skin. This one, however, was taller and stood upright on 2 legs, half hidden in the shadows. We rushed the kids in, but neither of us slept that night. The next day, someone or something slashed 2 of our car's tires. It was 3 a.m., and I was driving home with a friend of mine. There was very little traffic on the interstate. Up ahead on the side of the road, I see what looks like a man sitting on a guardrail. I got a horrible feeling in my gut. I had the feeling this guy was going to do something bad. I honestly felt as though he was going to jump in front of our truck to commit suicide or something. As we get closer, he stands up. I moved into the next lane. As we get closer, he starts walking into the road. I started panicking. There was no time to slow down, and I could not swerve to avoid him for fear of rolling the truck. My friend and I started screaming. Just as we were about to hit, what I thought was a man jumps, has ducking wings, and jumps over the entire truck. It was only visible for a second, but I can still remember it as clear as day. It had the body of a man from the head to the waist, but from the waist down, it was hairy. The wings were also dark. The feet were the worst. Instead of human feet, were these horrible talons, similar to those of a chicken? Also dark and hairy? The best comparison I can make is that it looked like a human-sized gargoyle. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. If my friend hadn't seen it as well, I would think I'd gone crazy. On a side note, in the past few years since that night, I've met one other person who has seen the same, if not extremely similar, creature. So I live pretty much in the middle of the woods out in the country in North Carolina. There is nothing other than woods for miles and miles and miles behind my house. Myself, my boyfriend, my parents, my sister, and my friends have all heard, seen, and smelled some very strange things in the 8 years I've lived there. The most recent account sounds like something straight out of a bad movie, and I'll be the first to admit it. It sounds crazy and ridiculous, but honest to the gods, it's true, and I've got 4 people who could vouch for me on this. It happened a month ago. My boyfriend, our friends Steve, CJ, and Corey, and I were all out in the backyard at my fire pit having a few beers and just relaxing and enjoying the warm weather. As the night was winding down and everyone was preparing to go home and go to bed, we all saw a very strange and bright light out in the woods. It was eerily silent, not even the woodland critters were making any sounds. It was far brighter than any flashlight, and we could hear no movement in the woods. We were all then suddenly hit with the unmistakable smell of death. We had been outside for hours, and none of us had detected the smell until this very moment, and it was so strong that it was like a rotting deer carcass was right at our feet. The light then began to fade out in sections, as though it were made up of many smaller lights. Each little section went dark, like a switch was flipped. In a matter of several seconds, the light and the smell were gone. We began to hear normal activity in the woods. Very strange and disturbing. I work as a summer camp counselor every summer at a sleepaway camp. Although I'm a counselor now, I grew up going to this camp as a camper. This story takes place when I was 12. This camp is basically in the boonies of Missouri, next to a gorgeous river and surrounded by forest. One of the activities at this camp was exploring this cave that's a short drive away from the camp. A longtime employee of this camp, who has worked there for over 60 years, always takes the kids out to the cave and teaches them about different cave formations, salamanders, etc. We will call him B. At the end of the caving trip, it is tradition that B takes everyone to a very back room of the cave and tells a scary story. Anyway, he leads me and the rest of my cabin to the story room. We are all getting settled down, excited to hear which story he is going to tell us. Just as he starts the story, one of the girls, who is much younger than the rest of us, gets scared and wants to be taken out of the cave. B asks one of the counselors, or CITs, counselors in training, to take her out to the front of the cave and wait for us to finish with the story. All of our flashlights are out, and the cave is pitch black, of course, to set the ambience for the story. Someone says I'll take her, and the two get up and leave. B tells the rest of his story, and we all head out to the front of the cave. On the trek to the entrance of the cave, he counts everyone to make sure that nobody gets lost. Since the two left before the story, we should have been 2 people short. However, we were only missing 1 person. When we got to the front of the cave, the camper was just sitting on a large rock, playing with some of the mud from the cave. Completely alone. We all asked her who brought her out here and where they went, and her response was one I will never forget. This old woman walked me out, she sat with me and talked for a bit, but then she said she had to go. She just kind of walked off into the forest. Who was that in the cave with us? She certainly wasn't with us when we went in. I live in Phoenix, and in my senior year of high school, some friends and I took a weekend camping trip to the desert south of Anthem. Typical high school stuff, beer, bud, bonfire. However, the weekend we did it, it was unexpectedly cold. Arizona winters typically mean we need a light jacket. That weekend, it was near freezing and soaked from the previous week's rain. After about 30 minutes of driving, we reached the off-road route we had to take to reach our destination. I was in the passenger seat of the lead car heading out into the desert. I was texting people in the cars behind me, looking up between these messages at the desert brush in front of me. My friend was driving slowly, looking out the window to miss any major potholes. A third person sat in the middle back seat, yet he was so far hunched over in the small car that he was practically in front of us. That picture I included is what this narrow path was surrounded by, and the biggest shrubs reached approximately 8 feet in height. So picture this, I'm out in the middle of nowhere, driving slowly, the weather is bad, and I happen to glance up from my phone for a very memorable split second. After a cursory glance up and then back down at my phone, I immediately froze. It took that extra split second of looking away to process what I thought I saw. Right at the edge of the shrubs, just at the end of the headlight distance, I saw for a split second something that appeared to resemble a tall, thin man in a gray morph suit. I assumed that the gray was just shadow, but in that light, it passed as skin in the back of my mind. Maybe 6+ in height, right at the edge of the shrubs, only visible momentarily before vanishing further into the brush. I assumed it was because the environment was visually distracting and kept me a bit on edge, causing my mind to trick itself. I inhaled slowly so I would sound as calm as possible when I told my friends what I just saw. Immediately upon hearing my description, Alec, the guy in the back seat, shouted out in agreement, saying he thought he saw the exact same thing. Cody, the driver, assuming we were messing with him, took convincing that neither of us were lying. After we set up shop, we told the others what happened. The rest of the night, we were on edge, but nothing new happened to scare us. Fast forward to this past fall, and I'm talking with a friend who called me to talk about a paranormal talk he recently had. Jacob was out there with us that night and believed what we said. After high school, he enlisted in the Navy, and while eating lunch one day, he found out that a fellow crewmate was an American Indian from Arizona. He found this out when a group of them had a conversation about Bigfoot and the like, and the guy mentioned his upbringing and some Native American legends. The description he gave was very similar to the thing that I witnessed and had been talked about in native circles for years as a sheep, and occasionally a child thief. Upon hearing this, he called to inform me about it. It was around 2000, and I was camping out in the middle of nowhere in the Idaho desert with my brother and a friend sleeping under the stars. My dad had just left us alone to go help someone who was stuck a few miles away. We were all just about to go to sleep, done talking about things young teenager boys would talk about. I was looking up at the stars for satellites when all of a sudden I spotted what I thought to be one, except this wasn't one satellite but 3 traveling in formation. Now I have been camping out in the desert for quite some time, and I have seen all sorts of military planes since an Air Force base is pretty close by. I have also seen Mirror and the ISS orbiting, but what I saw could only be explained as looking like 3 satellites moving in a perfect triangle formation. To my eye, they appeared to be slightly moving in their formation, but it could have been a trick of the eye. These lights never blinked, they were a solid white color, like any orbiting body, and they slowly traveled across the sky till they vanished over the horizon. Back in the early 2000s, we were living in a small house in North Carolina. The oldest daughter had a room of her own, and the 2 youngest, about 7 and 5 then, shared the largest bedroom. Our youngest daughter had grown her hair out that year after keeping it in a page boy style for a couple of years. One evening, the wife and I had gone to bed, and about 10:30, I heard the youngest come walking down the hallway to our bedroom. She had sometimes gotten spooked at night, like small children do, and would crawl in the bed with us. I stuck my head up and looked forward to the door to the hallway. I saw the shadow of my daughter with short page boy hair, called to her, and saw the shadow run off up the hallway. I got up and checked on her. She was dead asleep and had long hair. I realized what I'd seen wasn't my daughter, but maybe a ghost of her? I don't know. It was the creepiest thing that ever happened to me. We played a prank on my friend. We were having a few at his house, and he was in the middle of painting, so we wrote on the walls with a permanent marker, etc. He found them the next day and painted over them, telling us to fuck off, etc., but he found it pretty funny. The next day at my house, my daughter is scared to be in her room because of an old lady. We told her it was probably a dream, and she said okay. Well, I slept in her room that next night because of this, and sure enough, I woke up with the feeling that I dreamed about this old lady looking at me. Our cat wouldn't go in the room either, which is weird because he slept on our daughter's bed. I tell my husband this, and he sleeps in the room the next night, and he tells us that he had a nightmare about a lady screaming at him. It turns out my friend's house was haunted by the owner's mother. We are pretty sure she followed us home after the writing on walls incident. It took about 3 months for her to leave, and that was with us burning sweetgrass and sweet pine constantly. It was the scariest thing of my whole life, and this is why I never tried to go near haunted places again after this. I went to stay over at a friend's place last year when his parents went out of town. There were 6 of us there, and I was the only one who didn't drink or smoke weed, strict teetotaler here. Anyway, when we get there, to the new house, our friend informs us that the place is haunted and freaky stuff has been happening. His parents even hired a few Hindu priests to exorcise the place with certain pujas and rituals to cleanse the place of unexplainable activity. At first, the night was going well. We were having fun, the guys were slowly getting drunk and high while I stayed sober. It only took a turn for the weird when we heard a noise and, upon investigating, realized that someone had locked my friend's sister's room while we were all sitting together in the hall. The others were freaking out, but I borrowed a set of keys to unlock the door and investigate by myself. I looked at every nook and cranny of the place and didn't find anything suspicious. I called my friend in, and he saw nothing wrong either. We then decided to call the 4 other friends into the room. When we returned a few seconds later, I kid you not, every goddamn shelf, drawer, and cupboard in the room, even the ones too high to be reached unless you stand on a chair or are 7 feet tall, had been opened in the brief amount of time we stepped out of the room. By now everyone was pretty terrified, high, and having a bad trip, and they kept asking me for reassurance, figuring that I should have a reasonable explanation, being the sober one. I don't, and we all go to my friend's bedroom and decide to pass time by watching anime till the sun comes up. As we were watching an episode of Bleach, one of my friends who was unfamiliar with the show asked, "What's the story about?" Before I casually said, "Oh, it's about gods of death who help souls cross over to the next world," and before I could finish my sentence, all the taps in the bathroom switched on, the bathroom door was open and in our line of sight, and water gushed forth violently for a few seconds before it switched itself off. Everyone freaked. We didn't sleep a wink, and we went home at first light. This is where the story ended, but a week later, when my friend's family returns to town, his older sister, who is mentally challenged and is very childlike, spends all day talking to herself in her room. He doesn't let it bother him until she walks up to him and says, "You had a party here with your friends when we were gone. You were drinking whiskey." When my friend freaked out, wondering who told her that, she just replied, "My new friend. I was speaking to him in the room just now." Needless to say, none of us stayed over there again. Where I live, in 9 Mile Falls, Washington, is a fairly suburban area but immediately next to substantial forests. You can drive for 5 minutes and find yourself on dirt roads with no visible buildings. I always enjoyed this fact. I still do, really, but on this particular night, it ended up putting me in a really creepy situation. I have a friend who lives about 15 minutes away, in an area that's more farmland than anything else. The road there is dirt, but it's not difficult to follow. Sometimes, however, when driving there or back, I'll take a different route, just to keep things interesting. This particular night, I was driving home and decided to take one of those back roads, which I had driven plenty of times before. This night was foggy. Really foggy. We're talking pea soup, cut it with a knife-type blank whiteness. Visibility was 10 feet max. In this fog and on this road, I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, for I ended up completely away from any houses, which didn't happen the last time I drove this. It was just me, the trees, the fog, and a dirty path too narrow to turn around on. Then, out of the fog, emerged a decaying corpse of a house, passing me slowly on the left. Alright, creepy, but not beyond reason. I kept driving, hoping I would hit familiar roads or at least somewhere I could turn around. After about 10 minutes, a decaying corpse of a house emerges from the fog on my right side. I was puzzled, but close examination revealed it was the exact same abandoned building, down to the pattern of shingles missing on the roof, like a gaping mouth. Did I turn around? I must have looped back without noticing. Well, at least this would take me back somewhere familiar. After about 20 minutes, I'll admit to getting a bit panicky, as I should have already reached the start of this road. Furthermore, the fog was getting thicker. So, in my distress, I was driving a bit faster than the level of visibility would dictate. Enough that I didn't see until it was too late that the road took a sharp turn to the right. I applied the brakes immediately, but it wasn't enough to stop me from entering the decrepit wooden gate with a large keep out sign that was directly on the corner, right where the road turned away. I slid onto this road about 5 feet and then felt my whole car quake when one of my tires slipped into a huge, deep pothole. Duck, I shifted to reverse, hoping I could get out without leaving the car, when I glanced upwards. The fog in front of me cleared, revealing a decaying corpse of a house with a gaping hole in its roof. Now I'm freaking out. Without looking away from the house, I pushed the gas harder and harder, feeling the engine strain to force the wheel out of the hole, until finally it breaks free and I reverse back to the road. I'm more or less flooring it through the fog now, hoping against all hope that I'm not about to become one of those mysterious disappearances. I slammed on my brakes again. The road has ended. I am faced with a grassy little cul-de-sac surrounded by trees. A breeze picks up, the fog starts to clear again, and a building starts to emerge from the mist. Before I have a chance to see what it looks like, I slam the gas again, donut around the grass, and hightail it. After less than a minute of praying, a well-lit house passes me on the left, followed by another on the right. The fog breaks up, and suddenly I hit the pavement. I'm back on the main roads, exactly where I expected to be. Note that, with the exception of the private driveway I got stuck in, the road I was driving had no noticeable branches or exits. I hurried home. And slept with the lights on. When I was young, I remember looking up my stairs and seeing something whenever I focused hard enough. All you could see looking from the bottom of the stairs was the hallway leading from my room to my parents' room. If I just stood there and looked up without moving, a figure with very slender arms and legs, completely cloaked in shadow, and bright eyes would walk quickly with a hunched back from my room to my parents' room, stopping only to take a 2-second glance at me, then continue. I never saw it anywhere else, and eventually I grew uninterested and stopped looking. After a while, I tried to see it again, but no amount of focus brought the figure back. Okay, so I grew up in Vermont, where every town is small and almost all roads are deserted at night. My 2 friends and I, they were both guys, I'm a girl, were driving down a back road probably about midnight or maybe a little later one night on our way home. We were probably only going about 40 to 45, so not too fast. I was in the middle in the back, and I was leaning forward with my head between the seats talking to the guys when something off to the upper left of the road caught my eye. It was about 15 feet above the ground, on a slight incline, traveling perpendicular to the car, and was pure white. Not see-through, but opaque and shapeless. It glided perfectly, there was no movement coming from it. Its distance and speed put it crossing the road less than maybe 20 feet in front of us. I could not believe what I was seeing, so I immediately stopped what I was saying, and when it crossed the road, I slammed into the window to continue watching, and I sht you not, it was ducking solid. There was no shape, no shadows, and this thing had a silhouette. That was probably the scariest part. The driver and I both started losing our SHT, and the other guy was like, "WTF are you talking about?" He didn't see it at all. He says he didn't miss it, that he was watching the whole time and didn't see anything. This freaked us out even more, and to this day we still bring it up and agree it's the single weirdest thing either of us has ever seen. This creepy experience happened in high school. It is long, but worth it if you read until the end. I live in a very rural area of the southeast USA. It's one of those towns that is so far away from the interstates that it hasn't changed a whole lot in years. It's an everyone knows everyone town, so local legends and myths get passed down from generation to generation when people sit and talk on the porch of old country stores or hometown restaurants, etc. Most of these legends are just myths, although a few people whom I trust have had a few strange things happen to them. So, there is this one legend that is pretty notorious. There is one hollow, that has a creek running through it. One side is a bluff with about a 15-foot drop, and the other side is just a normal-looking creek bank. For years, people have killed themselves in one particular spot. There is a huge, extremely old tree next to a bank on the side with a 15-foot drop straight down. In the early 1900s and late 1800s, 5 to 7 men and 1 woman, including my great-great, however many greats, grandpa, were found dead. Most committed suicide by knife, but later on they started hanging themselves from that huge tree over the bluff. They would do it over the branch that extends the farthest over the creek. Most of these people weren't depressed or showed any signs of suicidal behavior. After a decade or two, it started happening again, but just every once in a while. There have also been other strange sightings and lights in the holler, so, my friend and I are making our way down into the valley with our guns and dogs. As we approach this spot, we see a small, faint blue light for a few seconds. We stopped and watched. Another light appears in the far corner of the field. It is larger and amber in color. We start WTFing. The brush around the base of this huge tree lights up with a sort of cyan color, and, almost simultaneously, we heard this guttural, human-like noise, grunt, and a pop. We take off back towards the truck, but Eric stops halfway. "We have to go back," he says. He reminded me of the old legends surrounding that tree. I explained to him that it was just a bunch of BS, and he said, "Do you think those crazy-ass lights we just saw are a bunch of BS?" He had a good point, so we put our stuff in the truck and returned to the tree. I shined my flashlight at it and saw something weird out of the corner of my eye, on the edge of the light my flashlight was producing. I quickly pointed the flashlight at that spot, and we saw a dead man hanging at the very end of the branch. He was extremely fat. 300 pounds or so. We called the police, and it took them forever to get there, in a remote area. When we returned to the spot, there was no body in the tree. The police started yelling at us because they thought we were pranking them. They had heard the legends too and thought we were just high school kids trying to be smartasses. We went back the next day to see if the body had fallen into the creek. It hadn't. The creek was very low with only a foot of water in it, and if the body had fallen straight down, it would have landed on a dry part of the bank. I lived in rented accommodation, a beautiful place that the landlord had formerly lived in and done up himself. My room had a fire escape running up the side of it, and we had one empty apartment above us and an elderly gentleman living below us. A few months after I first moved there, I was kept awake by something, a sensation at first that left me feeling overly alert for whatever reason. Eventually I started drifting off when I was startled awake by the sound of breathing. I felt my body shrivel with fear as I tried to figure out who was in my apartment. The next 2 hours were a combination of me moving slowly but purposefully around the apartment, ear to each window, floorboard, and wall, trying to find the source of this before giving up and laying in bed with my light on. As I started to drift off, I heard it again, mimicking my own breathing pattern. I made a decision in my head to breathe a few more, then stop mid-breath suddenly. As I did, the other breathing continued on for a split second, then there was a gasping sound. I ducking. Froze. I have never been so scared in my life. There had to be someone in my apartment. I threw my sash window open with a long steel ruler in my hand, convinced they were on the fire escape, to find the silence of night and nobody around. I paced around the apartment for the next hour, looking in cupboards and furniture, even turning the sofa over with the ruler sword still clasped in my hand. Nothing. I didn't get any sleep that night, but in time forgot about it. Then the landlord was round a couple of months later and I was making him a cup of tea and asked him why he ever left such a lovely apartment, and he laughed nervously and then said, "Oh, family stuff." I said I loved it, but it was a bit creepy sometimes, and I freaked out a while back because I heard someone breathing, but it must have just been the old man downstairs. His face just dropped, and he asked where it was, and I told him the bedroom. He then proceeded to tell me that the reason they moved out was because his wife used to hear breathing, and he never believed it, but she threatened to leave him if they didn't move house as she was pregnant at the time and refused to bring their kid up there.